One of the most infamous cases of missing ships is the French submarine Surcouf. This massive submarine has become the source of many conspiracy theories, ranging from the mundane to the fantastical. I'll cover those towards the end of the video. First, let's look at the design and service of Surcouf, France's best attempt at an undersea cruiser. That story originated in the early 1920s, in the immediate aftermath of the Washington Naval Treaty. This put severe caps on construction for all the signatory navies. None of the countries involved were particularly happy with this, and you would almost immediately see rules lawyering and treaty dodging. One classic example is the creative use of tonnage on the Lexington-class carrier. Surcouf would be another example, simply because submarines were not limited in the same way as larger ships. There were no restrictions on size or on what they were equipped with. Following the example set by the large German U-cruisers, several navies began to experiment, mostly because of the limits on cruisers. France, in common with other imperial powers, required a large cruiser force to support the far-flung colonies. That force was now heavily limited in a way it hadn't been before. As a result, the French looked to submarines for colony communication and for hunting shipping between them. Surcouf was intended to be just the first of several large cruiser submarines. With this in mind, let's look at what the French actually ended up with. As designed, Surcouf displaced around 3,300 tons on the surface. This rose as high as 4,400 tons when submerged. For reference, the average submarine in 1927, when Surcouf was laid down, was nowhere near that large. Take the American S-boats, which were more like 1,200 tons when submerged. Even the large British fleet boats, like the O-class, only reached around 2,000 tons. Surcouf was, from top to bottom, hilariously oversized. This continued with her equipment. The main feature of the boat, largely responsible for her size, was the main battery. In a time where most submarines were carrying 4-inch deck guns, Surcouf went a step beyond. The submarine had a rounded and sealed turret at the front of the conning tower that held two 203mm 8-inch guns, with 60 shells in the magazine to supply them. Although you'll also see 600 shells thrown around, though this does seem a bit high, even on a sub of this size. This, not the torpedoes, was the main weaponry of the submarine. These were heavy cruiser guns, with all that implies. For example, to carry such heavy guns, and the ammunition for them, Surcouf had to make sacrifices, mostly when it came to the torpedoes, the usual main weapon of a submarine. Surcouf carried 10 torpedo tubes in total, 4 550mm 22-inch tubes in the bow in a standard layout, and then a further 6 tubes carried on external launchers in the aft superstructure. 2 more 550mm tubes, one on each broadside, and then 4 400mm 16-inch tubes alongside them, with 2 on either side. The compromise for the turret came in the reserve loadout. With most of the magazine space dedicated to shells, Surcouf only carried 12 spare torpedoes, 8 for the 550mm tubes, and 4 for the 400mm tubes. A single reload for each tube, with 2 spares of the larger torpedoes. The light weaponry, for its part, consisted of 2 single 37mm guns, and 4 13.2mm machine guns in 2 twin mounts. All of this could be pushed through the water at around 18.5 knots on the surface, and 10 knots submerged. Remarkably fast for the time, especially considering her size. And, to round things off, the French also managed to cram a single small floatplane and its hangar aboard the submarine. This was carried aft of the conning tower to provide scouting and spotting support on the surface. In addition, the sub also carried a couple motorboats and a brig large enough for 40 prisoners. With all of that out of the way, let's look at the service history. Surcouf was laid down on July 1st, 1927. The boat would then be launched on November 18th, 1929. This was a rather lengthy construction period for a submarine, but then Surcouf was far from your average sub. Her fitting out process would end up taking even longer. Surcouf would only commission on April 16, 1934. By this point, the London Naval Treaty had come and gone, resulting in a new set of limitations. Submarines were no longer allowed to exceed 2,800 tons, and couldn't carry guns larger than 6.1 inches in caliber. The loopholes the French had exploited were firmly closed shut at this point. Because of this, Surcouf would end up being the only submarine of her type, and only then because the French insisted on being allowed to keep their brand new boat, as a one-off exception admittedly, but still. In any event, Surcouf finally entered service, along with some pretty major issues to try and sort out. Those issues being why she had a long period between launching and commissioning. And even after she was commissioned, they remained. Most of these revolved around that massive turret. Issues that would never be present on a proper cruiser, but on a submarine, they were very noticeable. For example, the rangefinder. The guns on Surcouf had an impressive theoretical range of around 26,000 meters or 28,000 yards. The practical range was nowhere near that. This was because, as a submarine, the boat was very low to the water. The rangefinder could, as a result, only work to around 12,000 meters or 13,000 yards. The French tried to work around this in a couple different ways. For example, using the periscope could extend the range out to 16,000 meters or 17,000 yards. Quite an increase, though still well below the maximum range. There was an idea, although it didn't survive to the final design, to put an elevated platform aboard as well. This would have been collapsible for easy storage and would have put a lookout to 15 meters, 49 feet above the water's surface. This didn't reach the final design because the sub rolled terribly. Putting a man up there was a recipe for that man potentially falling out, or at best, being a seasick mess who couldn't perform his job properly. Thus, the floatplane. While not as good as a proper rangefinder and scout combination, it could direct fire out to the maximum range, in theory. Another problem that came up during testing was a rolling issue. Surcouf had to fire her guns when the boat was level, which required precise timing to match the pitch and roll. And with how top-heavy Surcouf was, she rolled even more than a normal submarine, which weren't exactly known for stability at the best of times. On a related note, the turret couldn't be trained over the side if the sub rolled more than 8 degrees, or there was real risk of capsizing. Even worse, if the weather was bad, or it was at night, the sub was practically unable to use the main battery. The scout would be grounded, which meant relying entirely on the rangefinder. That made observing fall of shot incredibly difficult, if not impossible. And if you can't track the fall of shot, you can't adjust your aim. All of this isn't even touching on the issues actually operating the boat. Surcouf was a lumbering beast, on top of taking 3.5 minutes to fire the guns after surfacing. Regardless of these issues, though, the French continued to use her. The sub would see several refits and modernizations over the 1930s, the most notable changes being a taller and straighter conning tower, and the removal of the radio mast. There were also some experiments with replacing the floatplane with an autogyro, although those went nowhere, in common with most autogyro experiments really. As the 1930s gave way to the 1940s, Surcouf's luck took a turn for the worse, and arguably ridiculous, depending on how you view her sinking. Before that, however, we have the year 1940. Surcouf spent the start of the war on patrol before returning to France. This would see her in refit when the Germans invaded in May 1940. The refit wasn't originally going to be an issue, even though it was an extensive one. Then the Germans began to overrun France in rapid fashion. By June, Surcouf's crew had a choice: stay in France or flee to Britain. The French crew made the choice to run to Plymouth, even though the boat was still stripped down for refit. and couldn't even submerge, making her a rather obvious target for German air power. Surcouf would still make it safely to Britain without the Germans catching her, something of a miracle because the boat also only had one functioning engine and a jammed rudder. At this point, things began to get even worse for poor Surcouf. First, on July 3rd, 1940, the British made their own move. This was Operation Catapult, intended to seize any French ships in British ports, to keep them from German hands. While the attack on Mers el Kabir tends to get the fame here, Surcouf was another conflict area. 3 British and 1 French sailor would end up dying during this. When that mess was sorted out, most of Surcouf's original crew chose to return to France. Only a handful remained, while the rest of the crew was filled out by other French sailors, most of whom had no idea how to man a submarine, let alone one this complex. Considering Surcouf needed over 100 men, it's not surprising it was an issue finding enough trained sailors. At some point, the crew also picked up a couple British liaisons, intended to keep an eye on the French and make sure they weren't trying to switch sides. Unsurprisingly, Surcouf's new crew proved to be a miserable bunch who had real morale and training issues. Not through any fault of their own, although allegations of Vichy spies remain common to this day. In any case, Surcouf finished a British refit in August of 1940. At this point, the Free French took command, although the sub served under the Royal Navy's overall authority, which was something the British were rather unhappy about, as they saw Surcouf as rather useless, or a danger at worst, with the continued allegations of the sub working for Vichy France. In the end, the British sent her off to escort convoys off the North American coast, well away from France and Germany, where she was safe from air attack, and where there was less chance of the crew sailing off to France. The British really did not trust Surcouf whatsoever. While this was actually cruiser duty, it did little to help morale aboard the boat. A series of further mishaps made matters worse. First, Surcouf was subjected to a bombing raid in Britain in April 1941 that wrecked the floatplane and killed one of the crew. Then the sub was ordered to the South Atlantic to hunt German raiders, which resulted in her arriving in Bermuda in June of 1941, where things got worse again as Surcouf left on June 30th for her proper war patrol, only to have 3 major electrical failures, followed by a fire in the gear room, and then a dive with the conning tower improperly closed, which led to flooding and chlorine gas leaks after the water interacted with the batteries. The unfortunate boat was then sent to the United States at the end of July for a much-needed refit. This took 3 months before Surcouf sailed to Canada, where she ran into a Norwegian tanker and freaked the crew out so badly they reported they were under attack by a French submarine. This was justified as the crew having even more issues with running the sub. It did not help the lingering questions about her loyalty. Neither did the seizure of St. Pierre and Miquelon on December 24, 1941. These small islands off the Newfoundland coast were under Vichy control. Seizing them should have helped reinforce that Surcouf was working for Free France. Except this was a unilateral action by the French, which just cast Surcouf as even more of a rogue submarine. With this in mind, it shouldn't be surprising that 1942 saw the sub sail for the Pacific. With Japan's declaration of war, Surcouf was sent off towards Tahiti. The story gets a bit foggy here. Some sources will say the British ordered it to get the sub out of their hair, that she would protect Tahiti against any Japanese aggression, but more importantly, would no longer be a menace in the Atlantic. Alternatively, the Free French chose to do this on their own initiative, and that the sub was going to head on to Australia after stopping at Tahiti. Regardless, Surcouf sailed for the Pacific. She stopped off in Bermuda before departing for the Panama Canal on February 12, 1942, where she promptly vanished. No one knows what happened to Surcouf. There are some pretty wild conspiracy theories out there. For example, that she vanished in the Bermuda Triangle, or that the submarine was sunk by USS Marlin and USS Mackerel, because Surcouf was spotted supplying a German U-boat in Long Island Sound in late 1941. Quite ignoring that neither Marlin or Mackerel's history makes note of this, Surcouf was afloat well past this point. Another theory states that Surcouf somehow managed to sneak into Martinique, remain there through May, and then sail back for France, with a planned rendezvous with the submarine U-69 on the way. Leaving aside the question of how you could hide a 360-foot-long submarine in Martinique's harbor, it's hard to believe that Surcouf managed to skulk around until May of 1942 before being sunk by a PBY. I'm not going to entirely rule it out because the article seems well researched. However, it's still difficult to accept the premise that the French hid Surcouf in Martinique. She was nearly as large as the cruiser Jeanne d'Arc already there. Even Béarn was only around 240 feet longer than Surcouf. But who really knows? The most commonly accepted story had Surcouf ran by the freighter Thomson Likes on the night of February 18th. This would have been about 130 kilometers, or 70 nautical miles, north of Panama. While the freighter did hit something, the damage was relatively minor. Certainly not what you'd expect after hitting something the size of Surcouf. This doesn't rule out a grazing blow, of course. To go along with this theory, there's also a claim a PBY bombed a large submarine the same night. The Germans have no records of losing a sub in the area, so that would tend to support it being Surcouf. At the same time, the 6th Heavy Bomber Group also claimed to bomb a submarine on the morning of February 19th. This means there's a chain of events where Surcouf was rammed, attacked by a Catalina, and then finally sunk by heavy bombers. It would certainly be in keeping with her terrible luck. However, until the wreck is found, we'll never know for sure. For now, Surcouf remains a lingering mystery that has yet to be solved. Oh, and before I forget, this picture is not Surcouf. It is commonly used as such, but it's actually from a Japanese production, apparently. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.